Welcome, colleagues, and good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this afternoon's colloquium talk. And if anyone has an objection to the recording, please do let me know. We record our talks, especially in instances like this where a large a number of our colleagues aren't able to join today, and so we also make our recording available on our YouTube channel. So for those of you who may have missed previous talks of ours, please do join. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon Professor McMahon, who's a professor of clinical and community psychology and the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Programs at DePaul University, which is in Chicago. Dr. McMahon is a leader in school violence research and chair of the American Psychological Association Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel. She has many peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and has given over 200 scholarly presentations and 201, I think now, to our audience this afternoon. She's also past president, fellow, and recipient of the Outstanding Educator Award for Society for Community Research and Action. So we really do have an esteemed colleague with us this afternoon presenting to us. So thank you very much for joining us, Professor McMahon. We also hope that you will enjoy your time at Stellenbosch, and we very much look forward to your talk. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Now, can we put the slides up?
Yes, you would need to see your slides, and hopefully everybody can see it in full view. People have disappeared. Is anybody online able to just confirm you can see the slides? Verbally.
It's working.
Thank you.
Okay, and can you see me as well?
Are you able to see us as well?
I can.
Okay, brilliant.
Yes, okay. Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for attending the talk and watching online later if you'd like. The title of my talk is called An Ecological Approach to Understanding and Addressing Educator Violence, Climate, Collaboration, and Policy. All of my work is based in schools, and I'm especially interested in schools because they're complex microcosms of society where they're the central socialization of children and youth. And yet we also have, some similar issues that we have in schools that also we have in the broader public. So, of course, violence and aggression are significant issues in schools as well as everywhere else. The work environment is stressful for many adult stakeholders, and there is expansive reach and potential for change. So here are some key issues and directions. One is to improve school climate, and what I'm advocating for is to focus on adults as well as students. So historically, we used to have sort of primarily just focusing on students, kind of leaving the educators out of that situation. The second is to collaborate with schools and national organizations to foster change. So we need to improve school access to research, evaluation, and intervention. And the third is to address school violence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of different projects, as well as engaging with organizations at the local, state, federal levels, and to improve research practice and policy. So I come at this from a social ecological framework, and we can think about kind of a Bronfenbrenner type of model where we have, an individual kind of in the center, and then classrooms, and then schools, and then communities, and then sort of policy. And of course, that we can think about each of these levels interacting with one another, kind of bidirectional arrows kind of across each level, so that sort of individuals are definitely influenced by the classroom environment, and the classroom environment is affected by individuals, and so on. So violence is a significant issue globally. In the US, 36% of US violent crime is committed by youth. And of course, urban minority youth and urban teachers are most at risk. And the community context is something that should definitely be considered and is quite important. Educators in schools are struggling with violence, and teachers' perspectives and experiences are often not included. And we need to have multiple perspectives in order to really address school violence as a public health issue. So I'm suggesting that we expand our ecological focus. In terms of assessment, we want to look beyond just the students' experiences and outcomes, which are clearly important, but what are the teachers' experiences and perspectives, as well as what is the impact of violence on teachers? And we know that, that there are several impacts, including poorer student academic and behavioral outcomes, lower retention of quality teachers, and decreased satisfaction and well-being. So we need to consider school climate, and we can think about climate including safety, relationships, teaching and learning practices, and institutional environment. And that climate contributes to academic success, violence prevention, positive youth development, and teacher retention. And I worked on a meta-analysis of school climate studies and looking at the impact on student problem behaviors with one of my doctoral students, Samantha Reeves, and we were looking at longitudinally what's happening across time. So there were 13 longitudinal studies of students in grades 5 through 12, and this was mostly in the US, although included some international studies. And there was sort of a longitudinal relationship between perceived school climate and so if you had better perceived student climate, school climate, you had fewer student problem behaviors. And that sort of was a predictor across time. So if we can improve school climate, we can also improve student problem behaviors. So we need improved measures as well as translation of findings for schools. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is teacher-directed violence. And I first started working on this issue back in 2008, and when we looked at the literature, we found that there was really a focus on student aggressors. There were very few types of violence looked at, and there were often, there was a reliance on principal reports. So when they were examining teachers' experience, they were asking principals, what is happening in schools with teachers? And that is often kind of an underreporting of what's going on. And you can think about a lot of reasons why principals might underreport their those kinds of things, and their own sort of reputation may be on the line. And not every single thing that happens is also going to make it up to kind of the principal. And there were very few studies, and the measurements were all different. I was asked to become part of an APA task force back then, and we were looking at asking questions about, well, what types of offenses are happening, who are the aggressors, what is the community context, and we did a national web-based survey in the United States with about 3,000 kindergarten through 12th grade teachers from 48 states who completed the survey. Okay, so then what we found in this study is that we had high rates of victimization. About 80% of our sample had experienced some type of victimization, whether it be verbal, physical, or property kind of theft, that kind of thing. And 43% of the sample reported that they had been verbally threatened, and 29% physically attacked. We looked at rates of victimization by community context in terms of urbanicity, and as you can see, the rate was 84% for urban, but it wasn't just an urban issue. So the rate was 73% for rural and 78% for suburban, so really quite high across the board. And then we didn't just look at students. Students were the most common offenders or perpetrators at 94%. Of the teachers who reported being victimized were victimized by students, but 37% of our sample also reported being victimized by parents, and 21% of the sample reported being victimized by colleagues. So really there's, it's not just looking at the students and the teachers, but it's also looking at the sort of the whole ecological system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a study where we did some qualitative analyses. We asked several questions, and this was the primary one, was what was the most upsetting incident that happened to you in your role as a teacher? And we did content analysis. We did an iterative consensus process to develop coding, where we did open coding, and then we organized into categories to form hierarchical structures. Then we refined the definitions. We created boundary criteria. We identified examples of each thing. We ended up with a code book of about 36 pages. It took us a year per question to code this data. It was crazy. So we looked overarching at the beginning, and then we went question by question. And we got reliability with Kappa on this because we had such a large sample. Often qualitative analysis is on a much smaller sample. So this was challenging in a lot of ways, but we got Kappa, and then we looked at coding queries to identify major themes. So this is based on that qualitative example where we were sort of saying, what are teachers saying spontaneously in terms of the types of most upsetting victimization experiences. And you can see that physical aggression is the first one, and then verbal aggression, and then threats. And then this is the one I'm going to focus on in this presentation, this lack of support, which is the fourth most common. And then you can see they kind of get more severe as they get sort of less frequent. But the lack of support, you might initially think, well, why is that a victimization experience? That sounds more like a contextual factor. But we actually decided that it was a victimization experience because of the way that teachers talked about these experiences. So they would say, they would describe this terrible thing that happened to them, and then they would say, but the worst thing was that my principal did not support me, or that they took somebody else's side, or they didn't believe me, and they didn't feel like they got support at all. So it was sort of like an additional traumatization experience for teachers. So we then sort of looked at, okay, so let's look at really these teachers who described, which is a little over 300 teachers that described lack of administrative support. And this was just a spontaneous thing that they described while they were talking about this terrible thing that happened to them, or that was very upsetting to them. And we came up with kind of this ecological model where we looked at individual, interpersonal, and organizational levels. And at the individual level, we learned about their feelings, so they felt blamed, they felt unsafe, they felt disempowered. At the interpersonal level, they talked about challenges associated with addressing the incidents with other people, and the sub-themes were active inaction. In other words, that people like the principal, or they were specifically nothing that happened. So they took action, they tried to take action, and there was actively no action. And then, or choosing sides, or very ineffective discipline. And at the organizational level, we learned about challenges associated with larger systems and policies, and that was associated with chronicity and escalation, insufficient policies, or use of policies. So here's some examples. At the individual level, my assistant principal told me I was overreacting when a student made a hit list and I was on it. At the interpersonal level, parents who were not willing to help their students, and they got upset and yelled and threatened me because I did. Then the administration did not stand behind me at all. And at the organizational level, it took days before the principal would sign the first report of injury so I could go to the hospital. So you can see there's kind of an expanded ecological focus on this, that lack of administrative support was common. And then that ecological framework helps us think more across levels. And in terms of practice and policy, we can think about implementing teacher and administrator training, engaging principals in supportive practices, developing and clarifying discipline policies, and implementing evidence-based school-wide programs to promote positive school climate and restorative justice. And at least in our country, there's no sort of reporting system. When something happens, it's very hard to kind of understand what the data is on that. So there's no place that they can report. And again, if people aren't even feeling supported or believed, they may not even report it. So then it's hard to say how big of an issue is this. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about broadening and building upon that previous violence research, where we did a follow-up study 10 years later. And in this case, we included all adult school stakeholders. So not just teachers, but also administrators, school psychologists, school social workers, and other staff. And we did a national online survey. and looking at their concerns and experiences, effectiveness of strategy, training needs, and recommendations. So we didn't ask about what was the, sort of the worst experience and all about that. We were really now trying to move forward and saying, okay, now what? What are you doing? How is it working? What do you need? What do you recommend? And so this is the task force that I'm on that I started chairing in 2019. These are my wonderful colleagues, Eric Anderman, Ron Aviaster, Dorothy Espelage, Andrew Martinez, Linda Reddy, and Frank Worrell. And we're partnering also with several national organizations in the United States, the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Association of School Psychologists, National Association of School Social Workers, School Social Work Association of America, and MCH Strategic Data. Okay, so we did this during COVID. So we were actually, when we started this task force in the fall of 2019, we were working with our partners, sort of having them look at questions and surveys, and then we were getting ready to launch right when COVID happened, and then they go, oh my goodness, we can't do that. And so then we decided to really try to build COVID in and learn from COVID in terms of what their experiences were. So this was done from July of 2020 to June of 2021. And we had almost 15,000 study participants with a major focus on teachers. That was intentional, 9,370 teachers, a lot of school staff. And this is kind of one of the first studies that has really kind of comprehensively looked at people in all these different roles, especially staff and psychologists and social workers. There's been more studies on teachers now and administrators over the past decade, but this is sort of a big study in terms of learning about all of these different roles. And you can see the gender makeup is mostly female and 77% white. This is generally the demographics in the US of teachers and sort of school staff that work at schools. So it's fairly representative of educators. This is a map showing the response rate, which, the locations from where people responded. And this is just the educator. I have a map for each, but just simplifying it so you can see that there are specialists, general education teachers, special education, and different other roles, and it's sort of across the United States. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our findings. So we had 49% of our teachers, this orange chart graph here, 49% of teachers said they wanted to or planned to quit or transfer. So that's a very high percent. And then, but it's not just teachers. When you look, the other roles are a little bit smaller, but still pretty notable. You've got 34% for school psychologists and social workers, 29% for staff, and 31% for administrators. So, between 29 and 49% of people wanting to quit or transfer. This is due to concerns about school safety and climate. Overall victimization, we had 54% of all of our participants reported experiencing some type of violence by any aggressor. And you can see that the rates for teachers were 59%, for administrators 58%. And again, we would say this was also at a time where many, many schools were in hybrid or remote. So that is something to kind of keep in mind, that most schools were not in person at this time. Okay, so now we kind of look at a little bit more about what's going on with different types of violence. So we're talking about verbal or threatening victimization. And you can see on the right here, I've got a list of what's included in that: obscene remarks or gestures, being intimidated, receiving slurs or verbal attacks based on demography, being verbally threatened, being bullied, being publicly humiliated, experiencing cyber or internet bullying, and being sexually harassed. So, and then you can see, it's kind of a complicated chart here, but I've got teachers. So this is saying that 1/3 of the teachers who responded said that they had verbal or threats from students. And then 29% of teachers said they were had experienced verbal or threatening victimization by parents. And then again, sort of similarly, 14% of teachers received this kind of victimization from colleagues, and then 18% from administrators. And then you can see each one kind of follows that. So the school psychologists and social workers is in the yellow, and then the staff is in this, so the staff is in this gold color, and then the administrators, so you remember in the first study I talked about the lack of support from administration. So but we didn't, in that study, we didn't ask administrators about their experiences, but what you find out when you ask them is that they are experiencing an incredible amount of victimization themselves. So it might make it much more difficult for them to respond in the most effective way when they're getting it as well. So that 37% of administrators receive verbal or threatening victimization from students and 42% from parents. So, and again, during COVID, when many schools were teaching online or hybrid modes. So this is the physical victimization. And again, so the rates are lower. This includes having objects thrown, having objects weaponized, and being physically attacked. And this is again by different roles. So 14% of the teachers reported physical victimization, and this is just by students. Most of the physical victimization was by students. So I didn't include the parents and colleagues and administrators because the rates were, very, very small. So, so that is another point to think about. And then one of the things I wanted to look at is, so this is a single item, I find my work stressful. And this is at this one point in time, then they were reflecting before COVID, I found my work stressful, and now during COVID, I find my work stressful. And what you can see, what you can see is that the rates of stress that they're sort of self-reporting here are going up dramatically during COVID. And that, we've all lived through this in the past couple of years. So there's a lot of reasons why it was incredibly stressful in terms of PPE and we didn't have vaccines and some people were being working in environments where they didn't feel they were protected enough and schools weren't handling it well, or then they're doing hybrid and they're doing sort of having to transfer everything to doing it online and doing it in person. It was incredibly stressful. But so you sort of have this stress level going up for every person in the school, and especially for teachers. And these are the percents for frequently or almost always. So I find my work stressful frequently or almost always. That's what I'm showing here. Okay, so we also asked about training needs, and we asked about to what extent, or we said, do you need, how effective are these? I didn't include the effectiveness in here, but how effective are these different strategies you're using in the school? And do you need training in these areas? And this is across all stakeholders. But so this is just the top 5 training needs in terms of 18 different ones that we listed. And you can see that over half of the samples said they needed training in social emotional learning approaches, trauma-informed practices, restorative justice practices, working with diverse groups, and de-escalation strategies. So I think they're really telling us what we need, what they need, and we need to be paying attention. Okay, so we also asked some open-ended qualitative questions, and we asked about concerns and recommendations regarding schools reopening. We asked about the biggest safety issues facing educators, and we asked about policies, procedures, interventions, and resources needed to address violence. These are the key themes, and we didn't do the detailed approach that I described in the last study where it took us a year per question, because our primary focus on this study at this point in time was to have an impact on policy. And if we waited sort of the years to take to do this very rigorous approach, we weren't going to be able to get out there in terms of the policy impact that we wanted. So we took about 4 months, and we had several different teams across different universities working on this. And we would go through all the data, and there were thousands of responses. And then we had teams of students and staff and faculty working on it. And then we would identify themes, and then we would come together and we say, these are the themes. And then we would distill, and then we'd come back, and then we provide examples. So it was rigorous, but we did not do reliability or cap on this, but we have a pretty good sense that these are representative themes. So there was aggression and physical and mental well-being, education and student support, policies, resources, and community and societal concerns. So here's some examples. So, and again, so each each theme had sub-themes, and so for aggression, a couple of sub-themes were from students and from parents. And then you can see, you know, and there were different types like verbal, physical, property-based, sexual harassment online. And then here's an example. I've been physically assaulted multiple times by students in the building, and they know that not only is there no one to stop them, but there will be no consequences either. I ended up in the hospital the last time it happened. We had one teacher hospitalized for a week last year when a 19-year-old student started physically beating her during class and finished off by stomping on her larynx. Aggression from parents. This included verbal intimidation, harassment, politically based, and cyber stalking and online. And here's a quote. Parents have been more difficult than the students this year. Our school system has been attacked online frequently. Parents cussing during live Google Meets in class has happened several times. Parents demanding grades and not wanting to communicate about the work. Parents don't like an assignment, so they band together online to bully teachers out of it and shame teachers. It has been toxic working with parents in certain aspects this year. Okay, so physical and mental well-being, and this includes sickness, anxiety, burnout, pre-existing health conditions, social emotional health of students since returning in person, overwork, desire to quit. And here's an example quote. The ever-increasing stress of this profession is taking the worst toll. I worry less about physical violence and much more about the trauma in my students' lives. Their pain becomes my pain as I attempt to deal with emotional meltdowns and constant, if mild, behavior issues. The workload keeps increasing as we are expected to meet more and more student needs with less and less support and resources. Because the positives of this job no longer outweigh the negatives, I will not make it to my full pension. So you can see that this is, you know, sort of represent, you know, the initial charts that I showed where 49% wanted to quit or transfer. This is like an example where they're telling us about their experience. Okay, education and student support. And we had a couple sub-themes here, quality of instruction and special education. And then I've listed examples within each of those, like the hybrid model is not working, or that they're providing positive instruction online and in person. There were some schools and some teachers and groups that sort of said things are going pretty well for them. So that wasn't the majority, but there were definitely some positive cases. And worry about students falling behind due to missed education time and discrepancies across groups. So here's an example. Disadvantaged groups are suffering the most. They are falling further and further behind in the current setting while the rest of the students are treading water or moderately improving. Special education is another big theme. It was also a theme in our last study. So, you know, we have students who are in regular education classrooms. They're not getting the support services that they need. Lack of resources, communication about students' needs. And here's an example quote. The process to identify students for special education or behavioral supports must be streamlined. It currently takes an average of 8 months or almost a whole school year for a violent, disruptive student to receive additional support services or be moved to a more appropriate setting, even with parent support of the move. Okay, so policies, a couple of primary themes within policy were discipline and lack of educator voice in decision making. So in terms of discipline, that included lack of consequences and consistency or lack of disciplinary support. And here's an example quote. We need policies, procedures, and interventions to identify, address, and respond to student behaviors that lie outside the management capabilities of K-12 educators in the general education program. Waiting for months or years puts everyone's safety, well-being, and teaching and learning at risk. Students who regularly use physical violence, intimidation, or harassment to control or avoid despite interventions cannot be allowed to disrupt an entire classroom learning environment. And then lack of educator voice. Educators have very little to say in what happens in the district. So the choice to remain open or go virtual is out of our hands, yet we bear the brunt of the abuse and ill will from the public. So teachers often feel not valued or respected in terms of the, you know, societally, in terms of the role and the prestige of being a teacher. It's not valued nearly as much as it should be. Okay, so resources, I have need for programs, training, more staff and support, physical resources, and then I have an example quote from each. A need for more mental health supports and trauma-informed care for our students, more training to detect people who are at risk and at risk of or who are suffering and at risk of committing violent acts. A commitment to give teachers, them the tools or resources to help these kids, or adding enough trained support staff to support them. And because of the way educators have been treated throughout this pandemic, we are about to face a teacher shortage. That's already happening in many areas in the United States. Teachers are leaving, they're having trouble staffing schools. I've especially heard about these issues in California. And if states don't provide some sort of incentive, we will not have enough teachers to run the schools in our country. It was a problem and now it's worse. And then physical resources. Open schools like mine should be closed at all entrances and exits, windows replaced to windows that can actually open. Response time to red alert button from the main office is too slow. Many more police officers are needed, and security officers, metal detectors are needed. Okay, this last group of themes around community and societal concerns. So we grouped all of the COVID-19. There were many because we asked about it and it was happening. So you can see I'm terrified, I'm worried I will die. This was also, of course, even, so lots of issues around lack of transparency, communication, accountability, lack of trust, and then relationships with parents. This is like communication, accountability, and then inequities within the community. So racial and social inequities, poverty, lack of access to therapy and medication. So, and then I have kind of quotes in here for each one. Parents hold the school accountable for everything and themselves for nothing. So they're, educators who are very kind of upset with the parents. And poverty reduction in the community would be most critical when kids are dealing with significant trauma, lack of appropriate health care, food or housing insecurity. Violence sometimes occurs. Certainly often a spillover from the community, gang or family related issues. We can't solve community violence on our own. Okay, so I'm gonna try to wrap up shortly here. So practice recommendations, we need to better support school personnel and student mental health and well-being, enhance school organizational functioning, improve school climate, conduct assessments, improve educator preparation programs, implement culturally relevant whole school initiatives, incorporating, educators, psychologists, social workers, administrators, as well as students. Research recommendations, develop more specific ecological theories. So sometimes when we have these broad kind of theories, they don't help us predict. This will lead to this. I think we can just sort of do more development in that area to specify mechanisms of change, developing gold standard multidimensional issue measures. So there's a lot more measures for students than there are for adults in schools. Very little measurement development has happened. And then we need to think about both individual and systems level influences. So if we're just looking at the individual, we're going to miss a lot of things that need to happen. And incorporating multiple perspectives and experiences, longitudinal, multi-level, mixed method studies, examining change across time and developmental differences, and then providing schools access, strategies, evaluation tools, and empirically validated programs. Okay, so policy recommendations, examining and improving policies across levels, assessment and intervention, informed by theory and empirical research, establish a national registry of incidents of violence. I mentioned that in the earlier part. Assess nature and extent of violence, address larger social, racial, and economic disparities, powerful influences of school settings and systems, work with state and national organizations and legislators, and write policy briefs and conduct briefings. Each one of these we could do a whole presentation on. Sorry, I'm going kind of quickly here. Okay, so one of the things we did is we did a policy briefing, a congressional briefing. That's actually online that I can provide the website for that. But these are specific examples in the US that kind of fall into 4 buckets of growing and diversifying workforce, creating pathways to support mental and behavioral health needs of students, funding educator training programs, and funding school-based mental health programs. And then within each of that, there's different sort of bills or programs that we are advocating to sort of provide support for, using our data as an example of why we need this support. So right now we're doing our second wave of survey distribution. So that's happening right as we speak. We're planning to do a third wave next spring. So this will be a 3-year longitudinal study. Right now, I'm also working with Renelle on looking at some educator-directed violence in South Africa. We're conducting focus groups. We have a couple tomorrow, and Leilani. So we're hoping to do several focus groups during April and May. We're going to be presenting at our APA conference, American Psychological Association conference in August. Renelle and I are going to be presenting actually in September in Italy at our Community Psychology International Conference. We'll be writing up a paper for American Psychologists, and we'll be doing lots of analyses over the next several years on our data, current data and longitudinal data. So just to want to acknowledge, like, in addition to the task force, we all have many people who have been involved, and this is just a list of that, as well as, of course, the people who participated in the surveys. And I'm going to stop there. And maybe I can get back and see you guys now. Hopefully you can see me. Okay. So I wanted to stop there and kind of pull it up for people to ask questions or, you know, have a dialogue about any of these issues.
Yeah. So oh, sorry. Probably. So I would just like to thank you from all of us. I see that we have one comment already from Eugene Boyson in the chat, who says this is really relevant topic in South African schools as well, and I guess it's also a lot of the work that you may be doing with now or aim to do. Says, I did my thesis last year and found that most of the teachers in secondary schools reported not being familiar with educated targeted bullying, and they only realized they were being bullied when it escalated to violence. So, Eugene, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
I'm not sure if you could hear Bronwyn, but she just read Eugene's comment and wanted to know if Eugene had more to say about that issue.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. No, what I've noticed that I've did my thesis, and even like most of all the participants, when I asked them about being bullied, they didn't define it as being bullied, but they saw it only when it's escalated to violence. That's where they felt that they've been violated. So for me, it was quite interesting also to kind of, and I think you spoke most of it being making aware in schools that teachers have been bullied. But it's quite interesting also for me that even the definition of the word itself, that educators weren't actually aware of that definition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, you know, one thing we can do, when we first started doing this work, there was so little work done on it that it hadn't even occurred to people that educators would experience violence. So, I mean, the first issue is try to assess how much of it is happening, because if you don't even acknowledge that it's happening, then you're definitely not doing anything about it. So you have to assess what's going on, how often it's happening, who is it happening from. So that was our initial goal. And then sort of to raise awareness, because I think the other thing is that people can, educators can feel very isolated, like they're the only ones who are experiencing these issues. And if they're not sort of aware that this is sort of, you know, I would really say it's a global issue. I have colleagues in many different countries who are working on this issue. It's a common issue, and we're not doing, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to be doing better, but people are not alone. And we first have to recognize the problem before we're going to be able to effectively do anything about it. So I agree, it's a problem if they're not even sort of seeing some of these behaviors. So, and if you could sort of think about some of the earlier behaviors that are more mild and trying to kind of nip those in the bud or stop those earlier before they escalate into more severe kinds of behaviors, then that's going to be something that would also be desirable.
Thank you.
I wonder if people can hear me. So, if
You want,
anybody
why don't
else,
you want to come up here?
So I wonder if there are any other comments or questions. Renelle, would you like to talk to some of the similarities of this work, perhaps within the South African context?
Let me just speak quickly. I'd like to comment. Let me just check quickly. I'm not Lilani. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you have done a study and gathered most of your data. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to say a very little bit about some of the findings that you've seen come through.
Hi. Well, my study is focusing on teacher-directed violence experiencing in higher socioeconomic schools. So it's the quintile 4 and 5, or the category 4 and 5 schools in South Africa. And the reason why I'm focusing specifically on those category schools is because oftentimes people think that parents pay you. You're supposed to do your job and keep quiet. And it's interesting that the data that I've received is that teachers have, well, the information that I've received so far is that they've actually experienced a relief with COVID because parents weren't allowed to go onto the school grounds, which was so interesting that they sort of had to keep, or when the parents were kept outside of the fences, their jobs were easier. Which was quite interesting, which came up a few times actually. So yeah, and definitely I think in South Africa it's a massive issue. I don't think that management, administration, I don't think that they're acknowledging that it is an issue. And I think it will be extremely prevalent if management of schools, if they don't do anything about it. SACE did write a workbook on teacher-directed bullying or violence, but it's based on the World Health Organization's one. And my experience on reading it is like, I thought, yes, great, it's wonderful that SACE has actually written a handbook on this. But I was almost disappointed seeing that it's not really addressing the core of the issue. Yeah, so I'm extremely excited that there's research being done in South Africa, because I think a lot of teachers are leaving the profession because of violence they experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I thanks, Lilani. I think what we are trying to establish is just to look at comparatively at what some of the trends are here, if there are any differences, similarities, and we are still in the process of doing that. Lilani started a study in a while back, and I'm supervising a study. But I don't think our trends will diversify too much from the US trend at this stage. I think, as you all know, we are a country that has huge levels of gender-based violence. And I think what we'll probably possibly pick up, I'm not saying it will be, is that there'll be huge trends, mind you, which I've seen in higher education as well, where there's bullying and victimization based on identities, so gender, race, etc., religion. And I think women particularly are significant targets of violence, teacher-directed violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Renelle. Thank you, colleagues. If I may, with a question,
Yeah.
Coming to the work through a socio-ecological lens, you have you have that acknowledgement that obviously what's happening to the teacher doesn't happen in isolation. So it's about the relationships with the peers and the parents. And as part of this work and putting it all together, I think, and understanding some of the mechanisms of change, I'm sure consulting with teachers, consulting with learners and with parents and with the other stakeholders towards recognizing what's driving this aggression, what's driving this impatience. That's part of this work too, I imagine, with understanding it from the perspectives of all of the stakeholders towards, you know, what are some of the underlying themes, what's driving that aggression in a parent to feel as though they can come at a teacher this way, or from the learners, you know.
Yeah.
So I wonder what some of the work has to say about that, if there is.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think it's one of the questions that, I mean, sort of how does violence, you know, why do we have so much violence, right? And because as I initially talked about, you know, schools, of course, microcosms of the larger society. So I think we can also look at, well, what's happening sort of, broadly, what's happening outside of schools, because that is also coming back inside. So if you have you know, families who have fewer resources and less education and have, you know, sort of where living in communities where there's a lot of violence and crime, that's just sort of survival too, of like, how do you know, what do you need to do to survive? And so what you're telling your children is also sort of different when you have fewer resources and less education, I think, than when you're sort of more privileged. I think you get different issues when you're more privileged, though. You know, there's more maybe conflict around grades and achievement and some of those kinds of things. So I think that definitely, you know, sort of the larger social and community context are big factors in terms of what's happening in schools. I think also, you know, in the US, we don't have good enough relationships with parents, like sort of that parent engagement piece. I don't think there's enough of that, so that parents are really kind of aware of all the challenges that teachers are facing, for example, because they might not approach, if they sort of more aware, they might, you know, in some settings, they might not kind of go so at it, but they're also very frustrated, especially when you sort of see, when you have this larger, you know, COVID being such a global, you know, pandemic where there's tons of stresses, where people are being stressed. So they're just focused on their kid and they're upset with the situation and they're just lashing out at teachers, and they're not maybe realizing that teachers are getting this from all these different people and it's making them want to leave because it's untenable. So they're just, I think, sort of seeing it from their own side and their stress. So the studies we've done haven't assessed parents. So we have lots of adult stakeholders in the schools, but not parents, because that's a whole nother study to be able to do that. But it would be great to sort of ask parents up, you know, to get their perspective about what's going on, because it's going to be different. When I talked about that first study where we were asking teachers about their worst experiences and that lack of support from administrators, but we didn't have the administrator side in that study, right? And then when we ask administrators, we see what they're dealing with. And then that sort of opens up your lens to say, oh, you know, so it's like, I think we need a lot of training. I think we need more resources, but we also need a very coordinated, thoughtful, strategic approach so that we're not just throwing resources. Because if you know, sometimes what happens in the US too is like, you know, people will come in with programs and then teachers are saying, oh, I got to do this program, I got to do this, I got to, you know, and then they're feeling overwhelmed. They're like, what about the achievement of the students? I don't even have time to do that. But on the other hand, if they're disrupted by behavior all the time, they can't even teach what they need to teach. So, it needs to be coordinated, evidence-based, comprehensive, sort of thinking about all the different levels. And I don't think we're close to being where we need to be.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Thanks so much for engaging me on that. Ronelle, I see that you're typing. Would you just hang on for that? Otherwise, colleagues, I don't know if for those of you who are online, if you have any final comments or questions. But if not, then I see we have a comment there. So True Most of the teachers being bullied in my research were females, and it was interesting that participants stated most boys grew up in a community where violence is the norm, and mirrored how men address women in general. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, that's something we're able to look a little bit at some of those sort of all the different ways based on demographics that people might be, sort of gender, but also about, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation and disability, and all of those reasons that might also contribute to that violence. We're just at the beginning of looking, so I just presented just a little snapshot of a few things, but there's going to be a lot that we're going to be able to look at.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely amazing work, relevant, important, and I'm excited to see how the work with Renal progresses.
Great.
So colleagues, thank you very much to everyone who attended. We're going to sign off now, so just to thank you once again, and yeah, as I said earlier, we hope you enjoy your time here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, colleagues. Bye.